We sneak out at night to a spot I found near the wire, a blind spot. Then we dig straight down 3 feet. Take the dirt, spread it on top so it won't make a pile, and then straight out. And then by dawn, we're under the wire, across the open space, into the woods, and gone.
The Great Escape is remembered as the classic war movie where Steve McQueen races a motorcycle and effortlessly steals every scene. But the real story behind the film is far darker than most people realize. One cast member actually survived a Nazi prison camp, while another flew real combat missions during World War II. Even the legendary motorcycle jump was performed by a stunt rider, not McQueen himself. And unlike the adventurous tone of the movie, the true escape ended in tragedy, with 50 prisoners executed by the Gestapo and only 3 men reaching freedom. Here are 25 shocking and fascinating facts about the film. Number 1. Steve McQueen didn't do the motorcycle jump. Okay, let's rip the bandage off straight away. The most iconic moment in the entire film? The one everyone quotes, everyone remembers, the motorcycle jump over the barbed wire fence? Steve McQueen didn't do it. I know. The guy who actually launched that bike into cinematic legend was a stuntman named Bud Ekins. And here's the kicker. Bud Ekins was actually a friend of McQueen's. They knew each other through their shared love of motorcycles, so it wasn't some random hire. McQueen trusted the guy with what would become his most iconic screen moment. Now, McQueen did do a lot of his own motorcycle riding throughout the film. The chase sequences, the terrain riding, he was genuinely a skilled rider. But that final, spectacular jump? That belonged to Ekins. And for decades, McQueen never exactly went out of his way to correct people who assumed he did it himself. Can't blame him, honestly. Would you? Number 2. The entire film was shot in Germany. Here's something that adds a whole layer of atmosphere to the film when you think about it. The movie wasn't shot on some backlot in Hollywood. The entire production was filmed on location in Germany, specifically in and around the village of Füssen in Bavaria. They actually built a replica POW camp from scratch. Think about that for a second. They constructed an actual camp in Germany to tell the story of Allied prisoners escaping from a German camp. The irony is almost too thick. And that German landscape, the forests, the cold light, the open fields, that's all real. You're not watching a set. You're watching Germany. The production design team built the set to strict specifications, and it gave the film a texture and a grittiness that you simply cannot fake on a studio lot. It's part of why the film still holds up visually over 60 years later. Number 3. Donald Pleasence was actually a real World War II POW. So here's where things get genuinely heavy. Donald Pleasence, who plays Colin Blythe, the forger who's going blind, wasn't just acting when he portrayed a man trying to survive inside a German prison camp. He'd actually lived it. Pleasence served as an RAF pilot during World War II and was shot down over France in 1944. He was captured by German forces and spent time as a prisoner of war in a German camp. An actual one, not a film set. When director John Sturges cast him, Pleasence brought something to that role that no amount of research or method acting could manufacture. Lived memory. The quiet resignation in his performance, the way his character moves through the camp with a kind of weary familiarity. That wasn't craft alone. That was experience. Of all the facts on this list, this one might be the one that makes you want to go back and rewatch his scenes most carefully. Number 4. Charles Bronson flew 25 combat missions over Japan. And speaking of cast members with actual war credentials, Charles Bronson, who plays Danny Valinsky, one of the tunnel diggers, wasn't just playing a wartime tough guy. He was one. Before his film career, Bronson served in the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. He flew as a tail gunner on B-29 Superfortress bombers, 25 combat missions over Japan. 25. That is not a small number. B-29 tail gunners sat in one of the most exposed positions on the aircraft, defending against enemy fighters from the rear. So when you watch Bronson playing a claustrophobic tunnel digger who's terrified but keeps digging anyway, you're watching a man who knows what real fear under fire actually feels like. That's not nothing. It's everything. Number 5. There were almost no Americans in the real escape. All right, here's where the history gets a little uncomfortable. And honestly, a little fascinating from a filmmaking perspective. The real Great Escape? It was almost entirely a British, Commonwealth, and European operation. The actual escapees were predominantly British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealander, South African, Polish, Norwegian, and Dutch. Americans? Barely in the picture. In fact, most American had been transferred out of Stalag Luft 3 before the escape was even planned. So why does the movie feel like an American film with Steve McQueen front and center? Because it was made by a Hollywood studio for a Hollywood audience with Hollywood money. The American characters, including McQueen's hilts, were largely invented or heavily embellished specifically to make the film more marketable to American audiences. It's not exactly a secret, but it's one of those facts that makes you see the whole thing differently. The men who actually pulled this off deserve to have their real nationalities celebrated. And we'll get to how many of them actually made it out in a moment. There's actually a deeper irony here worth sitting with. The screenwriter, James Clavell, yes, the same James Clavell who later wrote Shogun, was tasked with weaving American characters into a story that didn't really have any. He did it skillfully enough that most viewers never question it. But historians have been quietly wincing at it for 60 years. The Canadians in particular have long felt their enormous contribution to the real escape was undersold in favor of the Hollywood-friendly American narrative. It's one of those cases where cinema shaped public memory in a way that the historical record simply doesn't support. Number 6. 76 prisoners escaped through Tunnel Harry. So let's talk about the actual escape, because the real story is every bit as remarkable as the film version, just in very different ways. On the night of March 24th to 25th, 1944, 76 prisoners crawled through the tunnel they'd named Harry and broke out into the cold German night. 76 men. That is a logistical feat almost impossible to comprehend when you understand what it took to build that tunnel. The plan had been to get 200 men out in one night. They didn't make it to 200. The tunnel exit came out short of the tree line, slowing the process significantly, and the escape was discovered before more men could get through. But 76 made it out. 76 men crawled through the dark into a freezing winter night in occupied Germany and ran. What happened next, though, is the part the film can barely bring itself to fully show you. Number 7. Only 3 men actually reached freedom. 3. Out of 76 men who escaped, only 3 actually made it to safety. 3. Per Bergsland and Jens Müller, 2 Norwegian airmen, made it to neutral Sweden via Sweden. Bram van der Stok, a Dutch pilot, made it through Spain and eventually reached England through Gibraltar. That's it. That's the success story. 2 Norwegians and 1 Dutchman. 73 others were recaptured. And for many of them, what happened after recapture was something so brutal and so calculated that it shook even hardened Allied commanders when they learned of it. Number 8. 50 of the recaptured men were executed by the Gestapo. Of the 73 men recaptured, 50 of them were shot dead. not killed in combat, not executed after a formal military tribunal, shot by the Gestapo, most of them in small groups by roadsides, in fields, in forests, in the backs of cars. This was not a spontaneous act of brutality by individual soldiers. This was coordinated, organized, deliberate, and it came from the very top. The executions were presented to the outside world as men shot while trying to escape, the so-called bullet decree or Kugelerlass, but that was a lie. Most of the men were simply taken out of their vehicles and shot without warning, often after being told they were being transferred to another facility. The film represents these killings with a certain restraint, a notification on a board, small plaques, a moment of silence. The reality was something far darker. Number 9. Hitler personally ordered the executions. The order to execute the recaptured prisoners didn't come from a local commander making a rogue decision under pressure. According to post-war testimony and the subsequent war crimes trial, Adolf Hitler himself was furious when he learned of the escape and personally demanded that all recaptured prisoners be shot. His initial demand was for all 73 recaptured men to be killed. Hermann Göring and Wilhelm Keitel reportedly pushed back, arguing that executing every single man would be an obvious war crime that could not be disguised. The number was brought down to 50, as if that made it anything other than what it was. This fact elevates the historical weight of the Great Escape from a thrilling adventure story to something much more somber. These men weren't just unlucky. They were killed by direct order of the Nazi leadership for the crime of trying to escape captivity, which, under the Geneva Convention, was entirely their right to attempt. And the cover story they used, shot while attempting to escape, was so transparently false in many cases that even some German military officers privately expressed discomfort. Several of the men were executed in locations that made the story physically impossible to believe. But in 1944, inside the Nazi system, nobody with doubts was going to raise their hand. The men responsible went back to their offices, filed their reports, and carried on. It would take the end of the war and a dedicated RAF investigation to hold them to account. And we'll get to that later. Number 10. The camp was in Poland, not Germany. Here's something that tends to surprise people. Stalag Luft 3, the prison camp where all of this happened, wasn't in Germany. It was in what is now Żagań, Poland. At the time, it was in German-occupied Lower Silesia, a region that was administratively part of the German Reich during the war. But geographically and historically, it's Polish territory. Today, there's a museum at the site. The town of Żagań has preserved and honored the memory of the escape, and the museum draws visitors from all over the world, particularly from the UK, Australia, Canada, and the other nations whose airmen were imprisoned there. It's a small geographical distinction on the surface, but it matters, especially to Poland, a country whose wartime history is often either overlooked or subsumed into broader Allied narratives. Number 11. The real escape happened in freezing winter, not spring. Watch the film and you'll notice it's got a kind of warm, almost golden quality to it. The men are outdoors in shirt sleeves. The light feels almost pastoral at times. It looks like late spring or early summer in Bavaria. The real escape happened on the night of March 24th to 25th, 1944. That's late winter. There was snow on the ground. It was bitterly cold. The men crawling through that tunnel and emerging into open countryside were doing so in freezing temperatures, in the dark, in the snow, with no transport, in a country that wanted them dead. The film's visual warmth is a deliberate choice. It keeps the adventure feeling buoyant and heroic. But the men who actually crawled through Harry that night were doing something far more physically brutal than the screen suggests. Number 12. The tunnel was 30 feet deep and 336 feet long. Let's take a second to appreciate the sheer engineering insanity of what these men built. Tunnel Harry was dug to a depth of 30 feet. That's deep enough to avoid detection from seismographic microphones the Germans had placed around the camp's perimeter. And it stretched 336 feet in length, running from beneath a barracks building all the way past the camp fence line and into the trees beyond. It was roughly 2 feet square, just wide enough for a man to wriggle through. It had wooden shoring along the walls and ceiling, a rail system for moving men and soil, and it was lit by small electric lights wired into the camp's power grid. Built by prisoners, mostly by hand, in secret, under the noses of the guards. If the film asks you to believe something almost too audacious to be true, that's because the real thing was almost too audacious to be true. Number 13. Over 600 prisoners helped build the tunnels. The film gives you the impression of a relatively tight crew doing the heavy lifting on the tunnel operation, a few dozen men at most. The reality was a camp-wide effort. Over 600 prisoners were involved in building the 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. 600 people keeping a secret in a prisoner of war camp under constant guard. The level of discipline, organization, and collective commitment involved is staggering. Men who weren't digging were forging documents, making civilian clothes from military uniforms, creating compasses from bits of scrap metal, and memorizing German phrases to help escapees blend in. The whole camp was a covert operation, and somehow, for months, they kept it hidden. Number 14. Tom, Dick, and Harry. Only Harry worked. The 3 tunnels had names: Tom, Dick, and Harry. And of the 3, only Harry made it to a successful escape. Tom was discovered by German guards during construction. Dick was repurposed, used primarily as a storage space for sand, equipment, and forged documents, rather than as an escape route. Only Harry went the distance. What's darkly funny, in a bleak sort of way, is that the Germans knew tunneling was happening. They discovered Tom. They suspected there were others. They used guard dogs, seismographs, random floor searches, and informants. And still, Harry survived. Still, 76 men went through it on that single March night. The name Harry has carried a kind of quiet heroism ever since. Number 15. 4,000 bedboards were used to shore up the tunnels. So where did the timber for all that tunnel shoring come from? The prisoners' own beds. Specifically, roughly 4,000 wooden boards were quietly removed from the bed frames in the barracks and used to line the tunnel walls and ceiling to stop them from collapsing. 4,000 boards. Men were sleeping on increasingly sparse bed frames, in some cases just a few boards supporting the mattress, while quietly feeding the tunnel operation. The Germans noticed men seemed to be getting thinner mattresses and looser beds. They even investigated it at one point, and somehow the prisoners kept going. The engineering and logistics of this operation, run entirely by prisoners with no power tools, no external supply chain, and no freedom of movement, remains one of the most remarkable feats of improvised engineering in modern history. Number 16. 100 tons of excavated soil had to be hidden. Here's a logistical problem that might not immediately occur to you. When you dig a tunnel 336 feet long and 30 feet deep, you generate an enormous amount of soil. Specifically, roughly 100 tons of it. And that soil has to go somewhere. Somewhere the guards won't notice a giant pile of freshly excavated earth sitting in the middle of a prison camp. The solution? The prisoners hid it in their trousers. Literally. They made small bags, called penguins by the prisoners, that could be worn inside their trousers connected to a string. A man would walk around the camp looking casual, quietly pulling the string to release a trickle of sand as he shuffled through the compound, dispersing it into the ground without leaving any visible pile. It was painstaking, it was ridiculous, and it was genius. 100 tons, dispersed handful by handful, by men walking laps around a prison yard. And it gets more elaborate. Some of the sand was also worked into gardens. Prisoners would dig over vegetable patches and quietly incorporate the pale tunnel sand into the darker surface soil. Others scattered it under the floorboards of barracks buildings. A dedicated dispersal team coordinated it all, making sure no single area of the compound started to look suspiciously pale or freshly turned. The operation had a nickname, the Penguins, because of the way men waddled slightly with full sandbags stuffed down their trouser legs. If it wasn't so genuinely dangerous, it would be almost comedic. The sheer human ingenuity of it is breathtaking. Number 17. Roger Bushell was killed 400 miles from the camp. In the film, the mastermind of the escape is Roger Bartlett, played by Richard Attenborough, a composite figure loosely based on the real man, South African-born RAF squadron leader Roger Bushell. Bushell was the genuine architect of the Great Escape. He was the one who pushed the ambition of the operation to its extreme, not just escaping for the sake of it, but to cause maximum disruption to the Nazi war machine by forcing them to divert resources to recapture hundreds of escaped prisoners. After escaping through Harry, Bushell made it approximately 400 miles before he was recaptured near Saarbrücken. He was one of the 50 men executed by the Gestapo. He was 33 years old. His grave is in Poznan Old Garrison Cemetery, Poland. He never came home. Number 18. The camp was liberated by Soviets in 1945 after a death march. Here's the part the film never shows you. What happened to the men who didn't escape? After the breakout and the executions, life in Stalag Luft III continued. But in January 1945, as the Soviet Red Army advanced westward into German-held territory, the German guards ordered the remaining prisoners out of the camp on foot. In winter, through snow, with little food and inadequate clothing. This became known as the Long March, a grueling trek of hundreds of miles through brutal winter conditions. Men died along the way. Those who survived were eventually liberated, many of them by Soviet forces, when they arrived in the area in early 1945. The camp itself was liberated by the Soviets in late January 1945. The men who survived the Great Escape's aftermath endured hardships that extended long after the film's story ends. Number 19. 13 of 18 convicted Nazi war criminals were executed. After the war, a British Royal Air Force unit specifically investigated the crimes of the 50 executed escapees. The investigation, led by the RAF's Special Investigation Branch, tracked down the Gestapo officers and SS members responsible for carrying out the executions. 18 men were ultimately tried for the crime at the Nuremberg-related war crimes trials. Of those 18, 13 were sentenced to death and executed. 3 received prison sentences, 2 were acquitted. It was one of the more successful post-war prosecutions of war criminals, though no legal verdict can fully account for what was done to those 50 men who were simply trying to do what any prisoner of war had the legal right to attempt. Number 20. The film grossed $1.7 million on a $4 million budget. Let's talk box office for a second, because The Great Escape was a genuine smash hit by 1963 standards. The film was made on a budget of approximately $4 million, not cheap for the era, but not astronomical either. It returned $11.7 million at the domestic U.S. box office alone, making it one of the biggest films of that year. That's nearly a threefold return at the cinema, not counting the decades of TV broadcasts, home video, DVD streaming, and the eternal Christmas TV schedule slot it occupies in the UK every single year without fail. The film didn't just succeed. It became one of those properties that perpetually earns. 60-plus years later, people are still watching it. Number 21. Steve McQueen won Best Actor at the Moscow Film Festival. Here's one that genuinely surprises people. The Moscow International Film Festival in 1963 awarded Steve McQueen its Best Actor prize for his performance in The Great Escape. Think about that for a moment. A film about Allied prisoners of war escaping from Nazi Germany, a film made by a Hollywood studio with American movie stars during the height of the Cold War, won Best Actor at the Soviet Union's flagship film festival. Whatever you want to read into that politically or culturally, it's a genuinely remarkable fact. McQueen's charismatic, deeply physical performance crossed whatever ideological lines separated American and Soviet cinema at that moment. The motorcycle jump alone is probably worth an award. Number 22. The film was nominated for an Academy Award for Film Editing. The Great Escape received an Academy Award nomination for Best Film Editing. Ferris Webster was the editor, and the nomination was well-deserved. The film's pacing is a genuine masterclass. It runs nearly 3 hours and almost never drags. The intercutting between the different escape stories as the night progresses, the tension of the tunnel sequence, the momentum of the chase, all of it is editorial craft working at the highest level. The film didn't win. It was nominated in a strong year, but the recognition matters. Because the editing is genuinely one of the reasons this film still works. On paper, a nearly 3-hour war film from 1963 sounds like homework. On screen, it flies. Number 23. The film has a 94% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Critics, it turns out, agree with audiences on this one. The Great Escape currently holds a 94% rating on Rotten Tomatoes based on 53 reviews. That's a remarkable score for any film, let alone one released more than 60 years ago. What's striking is that the film holds up not just as a piece of nostalgia or a historical document, but as a genuinely well-constructed piece of cinema by any modern standard. The performances, the pacing, the production design, the score by Elmer Bernstein, that theme you're hearing in your head right now, yes, that one, all of it still works. 94% is not a number you get by accident, and it's not a number you maintain for 6 decades without the film genuinely earning it, over and over, with every new generation of viewers. Number 24. Elmer Bernstein's theme became one of cinema's most recognizable pieces of music. You already know this theme. Even if you've never seen the film, you know this theme. The Elmer Bernstein March, that bright, insistent, whistled melody, has become one of the most culturally embedded pieces of film music ever written. It's been used in adverts, in sports broadcasts, at football grounds across the UK. It's played at the end of school terms. It soundtracks people's last day at jobs they're glad to leave. It is, culturally, the sound of escape, of optimism against the odds, of thumbing your nose at authority and making a run for it. Bernstein wrote it to be both heroic and slightly absurd, to capture the almost cheerful audacity of what these men attempted. He absolutely nailed it. The fact that the theme now outlives most people's knowledge of the actual film is either a tragedy or the highest possible compliment. Probably both. Number 25. The real location is now a museum and memorial. And finally, this one feels important to end on. The site of Stalag Luft 3 in what is now Żagań, Poland, is today home to a museum dedicated to the escape and to the men who planned, built, and attempted it. The Museum of Escape, Muzeum Martyrologii Alianckich Jeńców Wojennych, preserves the history of the camp, the tunnels, and the fates of the men involved. A section of tunnel has been reconstructed. The stories of the 50 executed men are told. The 3 who made it home are remembered. The hundreds who built, forged, scraped, and planned in secret are honored. Every year, veterans' families, historians, and visitors from around the world make the trip to Żagań. Because as wild and thrilling as the film version is, the real story, the real men, the real sacrifice, the real horror, and the real heroism deserves to be remembered with more than just a movie ticket. And the next time you watch The Great Escape and hear that theme kick in, you'll know exactly how much weight is hiding underneath the adventure. And that's your 25 weird, dark, surprising facts about The Great Escape. A film that is genuinely so much more than a popcorn action movie once you pull back the curtain on what it's actually about. Real men, a real tunnel, real executions, and 3 people who actually made it home. What makes this film stick, beyond the craft and the performances and that irresistible theme, is that it's built on a true story of human stubbornness. 600 men in a prison camp deciding that they were going to make the most audacious, coordinated, technically complex escape attempt in the history of modern warfare. Not because it was practical, not because the odds were good, but because giving up wasn't something they were willing to do. That's what the film is really about, and the real men who lived it deserved every frame of it. If this video gave you something you didn't know before, whether that's the Bud Ekins motorcycle truth, the fact that Donald Pleasance lived the thing he was acting, or the devastating reality that 50 men were killed after recapture, then do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people find this stuff, and honestly, these stories deserve to be heard. Subscribe if you're not already on board. We dig into films like this all the time, pulling apart the history and the behind-the-scenes weirdness that makes cinema so much more interesting than it first appears. And let me know in the comments which fact shocked you the most, because honestly, this story gets crazier the deeper you dig into it. Drop a comment below. I want to know which fact hit you hardest. My money's on the 50 executions, or maybe the 3 out of 76. But y'all might surprise me. If you've never actually seen The Great Escape, seriously, what are you doing? Go watch it, right now. That movie has earned its legendary status. See you in the next one.